Well, the Russian foreign minister is visiting Africa on the second such trip in less than a year since the start of the conflict in the Ukraine in February 2022. Lavrov will visit 4 countries in southern Africa before returning to the continent in February with a tour of North African countries. Here is Robert Nagila with more details.
In what is being seen as a ramping up of diplomatic efforts by Russia in Africa, Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov kicked off his 4-nation Africa tour on Monday with a visit to South Africa. After South Africa, he's expected to visit Eswatini, Botswana and Angola before he heads back home. Lavrov is expected back on the continent next month, this time for a tour of North African states including Tunisia, Mauritania, Algeria and Morocco. According to the Institute for Security Studies, after his February trip, Lavrov will have visited 12 African countries, including the African Union, in just 6 months. During his July 2022 trip to the continent, the Russian foreign minister visited Egypt, the Republic of Congo, Uganda and Ethiopia and held meetings with the African Union leadership. In the last few years, there's been a growing Russian influence across Africa. Several African countries, many of them former French colonies, have warmed up to cooperation with Russia, signaling a shift from their traditional partners. In August 2018, the Central African Republic signed a security agreement with Russia, followed by Mali in November last year. Lately, Burkina Faso has been inching closer to Russia as its relations with former colonial master France continue to deteriorate. In October 2019, Russia hosted the first Russia-Africa summit where they agreed on, among other things, political, security and trade and economic cooperation. The second Africa Summit is scheduled for July 2023 in St. Petersburg, Russia. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Well, let's bring in Koffi Kouakou. He's an Africa analyst and senior research fellow at the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. He's joining us live via Zoom. Koffi, thank you for joining us on the program. Now, Russia has escalated its diplomacy in Africa in the past 1 year, with Foreign Minister Lavrov visiting, and touring 12 countries by July. What is behind this escalation, which appears to coincide with the Ukraine conflict?
Very, very important. This is such an important visit. In fact, I would say that Russian diplomacy in Africa is on steroids. And the reason I'm saying that is this sort of escalation is governed by 3 important reasons for me. The first one is that now it's a geopolitical realignment that is really the renewed of new partnerships. That's really as a consequence, as you say, in part by the Ukraine crisis and the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war seems to have accelerated that kind of, diplomacy from Russia, finding new partners so that it doesn't become too isolated at international level. The second reason for me is the geo-economic competition that is now with the US-led West. That includes a couple of things. The first one is the energy crisis that came out of the Ukraine crisis. And then the second one is that I think Russia and many other countries are trying to escape the US economic hegemony that is really choking them to a certain degree. And now the third reason is that Africa matters more than ever. And we can see that because the competition is very intense.
So Africa matters, and that is visible from the geopolitics shaping up. How are African countries, though, benefiting from this intensified diplomatic foray by Russia?
Oh, there are numerous ones. There are numerous ways, cultural and so forth. But one of the 3 most important things for me is that the first one is that there's now a new geopolitical visibility for Africa. It's a potential for Africa to be, not yet, but as a global player, to start doing that by association with powers that are already giant by themselves, like Russia, China, and any other powers that are alternative to the West. And then, of course, by that association, Africa will be a little bit more visible and then claim some kind of space. The second one is that it's helped Africa's agenda start to take shape, where African leaders themselves and Africans will realize that, by goodness, we do have a way to make ourselves not only known, but our interests also being taken care, be known out there. And then, of course, the third one, and I think also more important, which is a form of benefit, is that Africans are trying to find a way to slowly escape the geopolitical and geoeconomic colonial chokehold and that the West has put on it.
Well, meanwhile, though, activities by Russian security organizations, whether private or government, are also escalating, especially in Western and Central Africa. What is the impact of this escalation on both Africa and Western powers that have been dominant in these regions?
I think it's very important. One of them is, for me, at least as I see it, the role of Russia as coming to sort of disrupt the old colonial alignment and line of the West, by and large. But what is most important is that there's a relationship between security and development. This is a theme that is so important that it's not being discussed properly yet. But I think if it is taken into account, Africans now have understood that the link between development and security is important, but most important, security must come first. If you have a secure and a stable Africa, development will follow very quickly. So that being said, Africans are trying to find alternative security and defense partners around the world, which is, of course, not making the former colonial partners, traditional partners, if I can say so, happy. But it's an alternative that's worth paying attention. And we've seen that the evidence is now being seen in Central Africa, in Mali, and now Burkina Faso. You've seen how this week there have been clamors about Russia coming over. So by association, I think African countries are now understood that if they can get their securities right, they might be able to get their development right. And that, for me, is very essential. And that's the evidence that's showing that out there, the security issue, but also partnering with Russia and then China, of course, in economic issues are really important for the future of Africa.
All right, Koffi Kouakou joining us there via Zoom from Johannesburg. Thank you.